California leading the nation in the undereducated. Getting rid of firemen because they're too, brawny and strong. And David Hogg gets into Harvard. No, seriously. David Hogg gets into Harvard. Next on The Dr. Duke Show. Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Duke, and this is The Dr. Duke Show. Happy New Year, and welcome to 2019. Every week on our show, we cover those stories that impact K-12 classrooms and college campuses across the country. Greetings to all of our listeners, and if you haven't done so, please consider subscribing to our podcast on iTunes. It's free, and never miss an episode in 2019. That's our goal. That's our New Year's resolution, that you will watch every episode. So let me bring in my colleague and my partner in crime, Katie Petrick, to get the new year rolling. What's our top education stories for this year beginning?
We are starting off with statistics in 2019, and we're out in California, where California was just named basically the least educated state because they are number one in the number of residents who are 25 or older who have never finished ninth grade. So they're number one in that, but they're number 50 in the number of high school graduates, which makes perfect sense. Now, the U.S. Census Bureau's American Community Survey, they did 5-year estimates. So it's from 2013 to 2017, and they looked at the statistics, and California has 9.7% of their residents who are 25 or older have never completed ninth grade.
Yeah,
and it's pretty. I guess when I looked at it, I was like, well, it makes sense because it's California, but at the same time, how sad.
It's been said that people get the government they deserve. And when it comes to places like California, you can sort of see the impact here. Now, I would be willing to bet a lot of money that a fair number of those quote, undereducated people, unquote, are illegal immigrants. These are the immigrants that they're bringing in. A lot of people have been talking about this story, but no one's talked about this, that what happens when you bring in primarily uneducated people and you fill your state with them. This is one of the problems of mass immigration for the poor, is that you have no way to fix this problem. California's done nothing to try to fix this problem. But the ignorance in California extends way beyond illegal immigrants who came from countries that didn't bother to educate their kids. One of the tragedies of modern California, the University of California system used to be a fantastic university system. It's now become complete garbage. And what you see happening here in California is you look at the government, right? And the government now is a social justice government. It is not a constitutional government. They are not wedded to traditional American values. They have contempt for founding values. I mentioned the Constitution and the laws of the land. California has no interest in subscribing to or maintaining or preserving those values. And they're doing everything they can to foster open borders. They're tearing down the boundaries between state and church by turning the state of California into a church which gets to run roughshod over the actual churches of California. And so you see basically government by social justice. And that is because for 25 years now, California schools from kindergarten through college has been education through social justice. And what you get with social justice is what you get with socialism. A lot more people on the dole, a lot more dependency, a lot more ignorance, a lot more lawlessness. Welcome to your future, California. It's going to be the future of the country if we don't wake up soon.
Yeah, and when you're talking about a lot more, okay, what does 9.7% even mean? Well, in California, it means more than 2.5 million residents. And when you look at the second state, it's Texas. And what do you know? That's another border state. So you can take a look at the entire list in terms of, how many percentage of residents didn't even complete ninth grade. And then you look at the same time about the percentage who've even graduated high school, and it's complete the inverse of itself.
And what's really amazing about the story, it is the progressively educated, it is the professors, the politicians, the lawyers now, who are basically telling us as Americans that the only people who really count are these uneducated people. So we are giving them this sort of sainted status. They're immigrants, they're non-Americans. We should listen to them, we should hear them. We're dealing with people here with less than a high school education, and their values and their worlds have to be honored over the traditions and the rest of the country, basically. And this is not going to end well. It is not going to end well at all. We have the same progressive, the gap I want to talk about here is the most progressively educated are the ones who are sponsoring the most uneducated. This is a very toxic mix here, and it makes sense. Those who occupy the high places of California are the ones who get to dictate policy, and you have all those voters now. And is it any wonder now, America, why California wants to provide driver's license for illegal immigrants, why California wants to have all of these special programs? Don't bother learning English, right? You just keep voting for us, progressive politicians, and we'll turn the state into our progressive utopia full of people who can't read at a ninth grade level.
And we have a lot of those universities that you were talking about in the UC system who are part of the, I guess, they're guilty ones for not showing due process on college campuses. We have an executive summary that was just released by the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, FIRE, and we've talked about them before, and everyone should go check out the website. They had an executive summary basically explaining just how bad it is on college campuses where students aren't allowed to be presumed innocent until proven guilty. Basically, you're proven guilty. So some of the statistics show that 73.6% of America's top 53 universities, which they determined from the U.S. News and World Report, the National University Rankings from last year, they don't guarantee students will be presumed innocent until proven guilty. 73.6% of these universities. So 3 in 4 of the universities say basically you're guilty.
Right, that's exactly right. And so here's playing off that first story. Illegal immigrants in this country have more constitutional protections than do, get it, our college kids. So we're giving more actual constitutional protections to non-citizens than we are giving to our college kids on university campuses. That should blow your mind.
Yeah, and they also found that 52.8% require that fact finders, basically, which is the institution's like version of what a judge and a jury would be, is that they be impartial. Only just over half of them say, hey, you better be impartial. What is that?
But impartiality means something very different to these diversity officers. The people who adjudicate these cases are oftentimes not even academics. They're just hired gun diversity operatives. Look, if we did a story last year, and I'm already saying last year, right? We did a story last year in 2018 about how all these big universities, Ohio State, Michigan, the University of Texas, they have like 85, 90, 95 diversity administrators. If you are hiring an entire bureaucratic class of diversity administrators on college campuses, and we're talking dozens and dozens of them, and you are paying them some of the highest salaries of anybody on that campus, you better bet your life that they're going to have to find racial and gender and sexual grievance to justify those high salaries. So what passes for impartiality for a diversity officer is not what you would and I would call diversity, right? It's the assumption that if you're a man, you're guilty. If you're white, you're guilty, right? That's impartiality to them. And so almost 75% of our nation's schools, universities, I think the number's higher than that actually, start from the premise that we're gonna dole out justice based on superficial categories of race, class, and gender. To be part of a protected class is to be innocent. To be not part of that protected class is to be guilty. And in those instances where there's a conflict between the two, you know who's going to win every time. Until, of course, it spills out into the courts where the Constitution still matters. And so we find university after university being reversed in government courts and federal and state courts.
Yeah, and if you take a look at FIRE, and again, I can't reiterate this enough, that people need to go look at FIRE and look at all these universities. What FIRE does is they look at all the different policies that are on these college campuses, and they give them a rating system. Sometimes it's a red light, yellow light, green light, but they do a grade system too. And they found that 86.8% of the rated universities got a D or an F for protecting the due process rights of students accused of sexual misconduct. And as we saw in 2018, how often that happened. They also found that of the 104 policies that they rated at these 53 schools, 0 got an A rating at all.
Yeah, I mean, and this is the thing. And remember, your universities, the vast majority of them are taking federal and state money, taxpayer funded. These are so-called public universities which belong to us, the people, we the people. And your kids, mom and dad, are not being fairly treated on college campuses. Your boys are being singled out, whether they enter college being told that their masculinity is toxic or they're leaving college, oftentimes being drummed out because of some unsubstantiated claim made by a drunken sorority girl 6 or 7 months before the complaint was filed. This is really remarkable. They're lawless. Universities have become utterly lawless places. It's kind of a rogue posse now mentality on major campus universities, right? Where in order to promote social justice, we are going to not just ignore evidence. We are going to bury it. We are going to silence. We're not going to allow the accused to confront the person accusing them. In the kangaroo courts I've dealt with on college campuses, in those instances where I have been investigated for something I have said or something some student has said, I have never once been allowed to confront my accuser, not one single time. And I was actually warned, if you attempt to confront your accuser, you will be terminated on the spot just for trying to defend yourself. So this is not a new thing. The numbers are surprising, right? 3 out of 4 universities, particularly the big ones, have no regard for due process when it comes to your kids. That means moms, if you've got sons, that means Caucasian parents, if you have kids at college, and we're now finding out Asian moms and dads too are finding themselves in terms of hiring, in terms of getting into colleges, in terms of certain degree programs and scholarships, they're being frozen out as well. There is no due process here.
No, there isn't. All right, let's turn to North Carolina, where basically because we can't have our potential teachers pass any licensing exams, we're just going to scrap it all together. I guess in August, the State Board of Education learned that almost 2,400 elementary and special ed teachers failed the math portion of the licensing exam. So basically, you know what? Let's just scrap it all together. And they might do this as early as February. Currently, elementary and special ed teachers have to pass 3 exams. They're all created by our friends Pearson. And this helps, that's what makes it so they can earn the license. So they have to pass a reading test, a math test, and a multi-subject test that includes science and social studies. And under the current system, they have to pay, I think it's $139 to take all 3 tests. But then if you basically have to retake it because you failed a portion, then that's another, $94 or this and that. And they're finding that these teachers can't pass it. And, well, we just don't want them stressed out, so.
Yeah, that's it, isn't it? That is a model of American education today. The teachers can't pass their own tests, their licensing tests. Teachers can't do enough rudimentary math to get a teaching certificate. So the educational administration's response, the teachers union response is we'll throw the tests out. Right? Yeah. Funny thing, the more you are subjecting American school kids to meaningless high-stakes testing that has nothing to do with what the kids actually know, the more you're excusing your teachers from meaningless tests, right? Let's just play this fairly. If teachers can't be expected to pass tests that don't really mean anything, why are we asking our kids to devote all of their school year taking these mindless, stupid tests that test nothing? I mean, go back to the way it was, right? Let's have teachers who really understand their subjects. I get it. If you're going to be an English teacher, I'm not terribly bothered if you can't do 9th grade math. That doesn't bother me. If you're a 9th grade math teacher who doesn't necessarily read at the highest possible level, I can live with it. Let the teachers focus on what they're doing, but hold them accountable. If you're an English teacher, make sure you're holding them accountable at a much higher standard than it is. Now, I'm not worried about the English teachers in high school who fail their math competency. I'm worried about the English teachers who don't know any English, who don't teach good books, who don't know how to teach grammar and writing and syntax. I am troubled by the fact that the qualifications to make teachers these days have nothing to do with academic achievement and everything to do about how bloody woke you are. Maybe they had a WOKE exam, right? Let's come up with an acronym for that. Maybe we just give all pending middle and high school teachers the woke test, right? How diverse are you personally? How diverse do you pretend to be if you happen to be unfortunately white? How do you talk the progressive talk? How do you plan to teach your kids, use your classroom to indoctrinate students into the progressive worldview? I'll be willing to bet you that 99.9% of our teachers would pass that test.
I'm already coming up with it, so maybe
Think
we'll
about
have
that.
it for next week.
An acronym. Give us reader suggestions. WOKE, right? It's sarcastic. Send us a great acronym. We'll just give the woke test to all of. How much are you willing to pay in union dues? Student, teacher, teacher union dues. How much are you willing to pay? It's going to be the first question on our woke exam. If you're willing to concede half of your salary to the state public teachers unions, you're going to the top of the list. Graduating cum laude.
Absolutely. Just a final note on this. So it's really interesting because when I went through the whole teacher education program, I was secondary education. So I actually had to take a specific test to be certified for social science, so history, and for English. But these elementary teachers, I've looked at their test prep books, and it's gobbledygook. It's all like critical theory, which you get all the time in English. And just taking a look at that, I could see why these elementary teachers who are used to not dealing with, maybe as high a level of English language is what they put into these books, I can see how they get frustrated and fail a lot.
That's the thing, that you're not actually testing for competency here, right? I mean, the old GREs, the old Iowa basic test, they put a passage took a big hunk of literature, something from a poem or a short story or a play. They gave you 2 paragraphs, and they asked you to read it and then answer some questions about what you just read. That makes perfect common sense. Here's a math test, right? Multiply these, long divide these numbers, right? Figure out this theorem. Use the way we used to do it. Everything now has to be couched in all of this socio-psychological garbage. Everything now, and when you were my student at the university, I remember we went back and forth about this. You were taking my English classes, you were taking your own education classes. How many times did you take the same multicultural class, would you say?
So technically it was 4 different classes, but it was the same class.
The same material.
Class.
We're talking, what, that's
4 or 5. I mean, they cross over, but yeah, it was
almost
at least
20% of your education degree was spent taking the same course in 4 different guises: multicultural, 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 multicultural. And you paid a lot of money for this, something you could have done once and been done with. And the big question is not just that you're repeating the course again and again and again, the same course on progressive ideology from course to course to course. It's what you're not getting when you're spending all the time doing those things. Well, you and I have joked about it, right?
Oh, yeah. Well, and the thing is, one was supposed to be the history of American education, but it was all about everything else, and it was all the social justice stuff. And then I got that, and the thing is, I had that same class going with another one, so I got it every single day of the week.
All right, 5 days a week. And think about that, the history of American education, which doesn't ask the question, why did we do such a good job educating the kids before? And why can't we educate them now? That was not included in the history of education course. What was included? How racist, sexist, bigoted, and homophobic American education has been since its origin.
Yeah, and we also had Howard Zinn in there too, so don't forget.
Howard Zinn, commie Marxist, yep.
All right, well, let's take a look at some firefighters who are too white and too strong, according to a UCLA professor, Corrine Bendersky. She's a professor of management. She penned an article in Harvard Business Review, and she's bemoaning the current state of gender and race makeup of firefighters. Here's the opening to her lovely op-ed. Picture a typical firefighter. Who comes to mind? If you imagined a white man, that's understandable. 96% of U.S. career firefighters are men, and 82% are white. Well, thank you. But basically, she goes on to say that there's too much emphasis on strength in a very condescending tone. She says, yes, they're fighting fires, which requires climbing ladders, hauling hoses, and carrying victims from burning buildings. But this is only a small subset of the job. She says that 64% of the time they're focusing on medical emergencies and only 4% on fires. And right away, what came to mind was, well, that sounds like Planned Parenthood, where only abortion is only 3% of the time is what their job is. So.
Yes, and you have all sorts of paramedics. You have also women in all sorts of other aspects of the healthcare aspect of what takes place at major catastrophes. The fact is that she doesn't like the fact that it's big, brawny men, oftentimes big, brawny white men, who we associate with firemen. And good.
Speaking of brawn, she says to succeed as a firefighter, stereotypically masculine traits like brawn and courage are simply not enough. Firefighters' intellectual, social, and emotional skills required to deliver medical emergency aid, support each other through traumatic experiences, and engage intimately with the communities they serve. In short, successful firefighters embody a complex mix of skills and traits. And yet, in my research on reducing gender bias and my work conducting training on general diversity and inclusion with fire departments, I find that when evaluating fit and competence, firefighters tend to default to a reductive set of traits, physical strength evaluated through strict fitness tests, for example, that serve to maintain white men's dominance in the fire service.
Right. In other words, let's have tests for firemen that women particularly can pass, right? So in other words, let's de-emphasize masculine traits. The hypocrisy of this woman staggers me. So things like strength and competency and brawn, those are social construct. But things like sensitivity and emotion and sociological interaction, these are inherent traits of the woman, right? Yep. These people can't help themselves. In denigrating the male, they are actually stereotyping the female at shocking levels. Okay, you don't like the reality that men tend to be brawnier, stronger, and that those traits breed a certain kind of physical confidence and arrogance, you might even call. That's all a social construct. But the fact that what we need in our firefighters are more feminine traits, like social empathy and interaction, right? Seems to me that the masculine stereotype isn't really a stereotype. The feminine one is, right, to project on women the idea that they're softer, they're more emotional, they're social, they're more verbal. Way to go, honey. You wrote this exam, you wrote this article, and all you ended up successfully doing was mass stereotyping women.
Yeah, basically. And you know what? I think what she should do in the name of social equality is go down and be a firefighter, try it for a day, see what it's like to carry that 50 pounds on her back, and see if she still feels emotionally
Well, you know,
connected.
I'll tell you this too. If something like 86% of firefighters are men, I'll guarantee you the number of women studies professors is higher. Let's diversify women studies professors, because women studies professors, being mostly female, they a shocking lack of diversity, and they're not accounting for those stereotypical masculine traits that we have to sort of balance it out with, right? We'll diversify the firemen the minute you diversify your own stupid discipline, right? Let's have some conservative firefighting type brawny men be women's studies professors, provide a much needed different perspective to the study, if you can't really call it a study, the hobby of gender studies.
The hobby of it.
Yes,
Very nice.
the hobby.
You're so woke. All right, question for you. How tall are you?
I'm not going to say, because on camera, I could be as tall as I'm 6'4".
Okay, 6'4". Well,
6'4", 195 pounds.
the camera. Okay, anyway.
The camera adds 50, 60 pounds,
maybe,
right?
yeah,
And it
okay.
shrinks you.
Well, then
Look
you're.
at you.
Look at me.
You're sitting on a telephone book over there.
I am a very.
She's really 5'11". I'm 6'4".
All right. Well, basically, we found out that from the University of Missouri that you, being a tall man, you could be called out for sexual harassment if you asked out a short woman. I don't know how that works, but in her mind, this works. Kathy Scroggs, she's a former vice chancellor of student affairs. She actually argued this in a deposition that a man's physical stature can be construed as sexual harassment. Now, Scroggs isn't with the university anymore, but she is involved in a deposition for a campus sexual assault case that pertains to a male student who has been suspended from the university because he allegedly pursued a female dance instructor romantically for several months. Now, messages were sent by him, and she says, "I'm not interested," and he stopped. But then apparently he still was going to these dance classes at the rec. And the woman talked to her supervisor, and now a Title IX investigation was launched. And so basically what happened, she admits, the dance instructor, she was never touched or felt intimidated or threatened by this student, but he's still suspended. And so they're trying to figure out what to do. Well, Scroggs, she's the former vice chancellor, as I said, she said that basically just because of this man's size, physical stature, that he could have committed sexual harassment, just his physical size. The questioner confirmed what Scroggs meant in the deposition, and she said, well, you know, I suppose it could be interpreted as meaning power, but I didn't interpret it that way. In this case, physical stature.
Yeah, this is a typical. We just got through talking about this, right? She was a diversity officer. That was her position, and so her argument is basically masculine characteristics, by definition, now are offensive. It's the flip story of the firemen, right? The fact that men tend to be brawnier, they tend to be more outrageously confident in their physicality than women, especially when it comes to lifting things. You just do a reverse on that, and you get this: the fact that a man with pronounced biceps or 5 o'clock shadow or facial hair asks a woman out, or even is in the presence of a woman, that physical difference between the man and the woman. The thing that gets me about this is notice how, when push comes to shove, these radical feminists who keep telling us there's no difference between men and women, they always default in their complaints to the unremediated differences between men and women. As much as they want to pretend on these college campuses, these women administrators, that men and women are equal, they're not. They're not the same being. And so now we've got a situation where it's not even a matter of men's attitudes or what men say or do. The fact that men have the unapologetic ballsiness to be men, right? To dress like men, to have male bodies, to develop male muscles, to carry themselves like men, that alone now could be the basis for sexual harassment. So you're sitting next to a woman, you're a big guy sitting next to a woman in a biology class. That's enough. Right there is privilege. The fact that you're twice her size means that you have privilege. Maybe we ought to start giving these girls a grading curve, right? Maybe we'll give, the boy gets an A, right? If we bump him down to a B, and we bump her B up to an A, because the physical disparities between themselves is predatory.
Well, I have that issue when any guy sits right in front of me. He's too big. I can't see the screen.
There you go.
I deserve my
All
even.
men, we're segregating everything, right? Maybe we ought to have a place to segregate on college campuses masculinity. Maybe that's the problem. Give men their own gyms, give them their own swimming pools, give them their own locker rooms and showers and bathrooms, give them their own dorm rooms, give them their own classes taught by men. And then once we've done that in the name of protecting women, we're right back to 1935. We're right back where we started. That's what you get with this progressivism. If you give them what they actually ask for, separate everything.
Wow. Yeah.
You're back to 1935.
And it's just interesting.
When women didn't go to school.
That's true. So if I walk into the gym, because this happened at the rec center, if I walk into the gym, unless you are a Hobbit male, I can basically call out every one of you and say sexual harassment.
That's
Right. And this, at the deposition also included the current Assistant Vice Chancellor for Civil Rights in Title IX. Her name is Andy Hayes, because it's Andy, not Andrea.
Vice Chancellors for Civil Rights, for Title IX, for diversity, for affirmative action, for equity and justice, for inclusive excellence, over and over and over again. You think the education major was repetitive, multicultural. You look at the way that these self-serving diversity, highly paid diversity sinecures on college campuses keep multiplying the same nastiness.
Yeah, so Andy Hayes argued that power is derived from the nature of the male gender. Her deposition was great. She argued that male University of Missouri students should call the Title IX office before asking a female out on a date to determine whether or not that they had a legitimate purpose, a turn of phrase from the university's student handbook that determines whether or not an act constitutes harassment. She actually said this in the deposition. Here's the question. I'll read it. Okay. Is asking someone out on a date a course of conduct on the basis of sex? Let me just ask you that. She says, yes. So you could ask someone out on a date with a legitimate purpose and not fall within this rule. Is that correct? You could. Okay. What I'm trying to get at here is a student reading this policy, how do they know what is a legitimate purpose within the meaning of the rule? And Andy says, well, I'm going to speculate, but if they wanted it clarified, they could call my office. They could ask someone out about it if they needed clarification. I don't know that many students read the rules before they take action. So she actually admits, well, you should call my office, but at the same time, I know you're not going to read the handbook, but, here's what I'm going to say.
But look where the premise where she started was. Power is decided by masculinity. By the very essence of being male, you have an unfair power advantage. That's the start of this here. And so you have all these legions of female diversity officers now whose job it is to fix that. And so literally she says, maybe you should call our office before as a man you decide to ask a woman out. And then you got to give your physical measurements. And how big is she, right? Can you imagine? Well, here are my measurements, ma'am. I want to ask this pretty little filly sitting next to me out on a date. Well, what are your measurements, sir? Well, I'm about 6'2". I'm about 195 pounds. Well, what about her? Well, I can't tell you. Let me go get back to you. He goes up to her and says, I want to walk you. I'm going to ask you out, honey. But before I got to get this cleared with the diversity officer. What's your breast size? What's your chest size? How big in them hips?
They're childbearing
Well,
size.
they're childbearing hips, right? So this is the kind of stupid nonsense that you get from these universities. But again, listen to how the game is rigged in their favor. It doesn't matter who you are. If you are masculine or are male in any way, that's where power comes from. But when you flip that around, right? To be male and gay doesn't make you any less male, we keep hearing from these people. But somehow that's separated, right? That privilege doesn't count. Or to be a man in every sense, except what's going on between your temples and calling yourself a transgendered person, suddenly you go from being a masculine victim to a masculine oppressor to a victim. And this is the thing that's so frustrating about this. It is so self-serving. When it comes to what they want, gender is a complete construct. There's no such thing as masculinity. There's no such thing as male. When it comes to redefining sex and sexuality, all that stuff goes out the window. But when it comes to feminism, the masculine is everything in terms of the oppressive. It cannot be both ways, ladies. It cannot be both the source of all evil and nothing substantial in and of itself. It cannot be those two things. And yet, in the illogic of the modern university, in the illogic of the female academic mind, those two odd impossibilities live perfectly together. Now, is that one of those social things that we're talking about that women do that men do? Is that one of those empathetic things that women have that men don't have? So here's the thing, stereotypes. If it weren't for stereotypes and generalization, there could be no progressivism.
It's true.
I mean, the entire premise self-defined premise of progressivism is to do away with bigotry, generalizations, stereotypes. You could not have the progressive movement without all of those things as your foundation. It is predicated on glaring, bigoted, biased, small-minded, petty, racist assumptions.
All right, well, I'm going to go against what these ladies say and remind you that size doesn't matter. Moving on to the City University of New York, CUNY, they're going to be hosting a Queer Milton event. It's going to be promoting the book that has come out for $120 and $89 for an ebook. So the book launch and roundtable is going to celebrate the release of the landmark collection Queer Milton, an overdue intervention in the field of Milton criticism. A glittering assemblage of the volume's contributors will discuss their essays with topics ranging over gender and sexuality, ego criticism, and biopolitics. They will also point to paths not yet taken, to queer Miltons waiting to be explored.
So, for those of you who may not remember your Milton class or your reading of Paradise Lost in high school, back when we used to read books 30, 40 years ago, John Milton is the great Western culture epic writer. You got Homer, Virgil, and Milton and Dante, right? So basically, John Milton in the 17th century created the great English epic, the only really great epic in the English language, Paradise Lost, which was all about the Garden of Eden, the fall of man, and man's redemption through the Christian virtues, through the Christian sacrifice of Christ. That's what Paradise Lost is about. So here we are. It is perhaps the most obviously, overtly Christian book in the history of Western culture. It is a wonderful philosophical and poetic expansion upon what the book of Genesis tells us. And so, what are we doing at New York University? Look at the language. A necessary intervention. You do interventions for people who are drug addicts or raging alcoholics, right? Milton's great sin is he is too unapologetically Christian. That's being treated on college campuses now like alcoholism and drug addiction. We are doing, university professors, English professors, are doing an intervention into John Milton's toxic Christianity by queering it. So in other words, they're going to take Milton's Paradise Lost, they're going to ignore everything in the book, and they're going to use it as an argument that Milton was promoting, whether he knew it or not, all sorts of a gay agenda.
Yeah, I knew this story would really set you aflame.
Because I teach Milton.
This is Milton
That's right.
is your baby. Well, okay, so the authors of all the chapters of this book, they're of course English professors, your favorite people in the world. But they also, I looked at all of them, and under their bios, they also talk about gender theory, sexuality studies, critical theory, diversity, queer theory, blah, 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 blah.
Is there anything in there about literature?
No, none of
That's
them.
it. These English professors aren't English professors. They're not teaching English. They are not studying English books. They are sociological literary critics. They are people whose whole job it is to tear literature apart and to reprocess it from progressive lenses. This would be like hiring a fireman to fight fires.
What?
And then not allow him to fight fires. Mm-hmm. Because, of course, there's too many men fighting fires. And then you put women in those positions, right? To deconstruct firefighting and to make it less sexist. What they are doing to your kids on college campuses, moms and dads, is exactly this. Even in those rare instances where your kids are given a good book to read, they never get to read what Milton says. When your kids read Paradise Lost on a college campus, they don't talk about Christian theology anymore. They don't go back to the book of Genesis to try to figure out what Milton was doing, how he was expanding upon this. They're not interested in Christian philosophy or Christian literary studies. They are using Milton's Paradise Lost as a forum to teach more queer theory, to talk more to your kids about why gayness is necessary and useful and normative.
Yeah.
It has nothing to do with one, has nothing to do with the other. That's what they're doing. Go back to the other story we had. Why can't our teachers pass their licensing tests? Because it's not about reading a book and explaining it. Do you have enough progressive ideology? This is the objective. Do you have enough of a progressive worldview that any book at all that you might ask to be taught, you can turn it into a discourse on patriarchy, sexism, racism, and homophobia?
Well, exactly. And David Orvis is the editor of this book. So he's going to get all the money for this, even though everyone else wrote all the essays for it. But this, when I looked up his bio, one of these is not like the other. He teaches early modern literature, Shakespeare, Milton, queer studies.
Right. In other words, his whole purpose is to apply queer studies to Shakespeare, Chaucer, and Milton, right? In other words, I am a queer theorist who just and this is the thing that drives me nuts. This is what the progressive left does. It's not enough to start building their new utopia, right? Throw away history. Let's throw away literature, art, and history. Let's start now and turn the world into a queer utopia. No, that's not enough. You've got to go back 1, 10, 100, 1,000 years, and you have to gerrymander and rewrite and erase what actually was done and said and make it queer as a foundation for your modern queer revolution. This is a remarkable thing they're doing, but they're not just doing it at colleges. They're doing this in high schools and elementary schools, middle schools now. They're taking books at all levels, and whatever the book has to say, they're giving you the same warped message about it.
And they're doing it with all sorts of books, including the Bible, as we knew before. And we have a new Bible that's out there and available for people to look at. We now have a new women's Bible, and that's thanks to Lorianne Savoy and Elizabeth Parmentier, who are two faculty of theology at the University of Geneva. Now, they make up the practical theology subset, which there are many subsets in theology, but this is practical, apparently. They penned a women's Bible because they noticed how little most people knew or understood the biblical text. According to Savoy, feminist values in reading the Bible are not incompatible. A lot of people thought they were completely outdated with no relevance to today's values of equality. Now, they worked with 18 other female theologians from a range of countries and Christian denominations, and they wrote the new women's Bible. They published it back in October, and now it's available for everyone to read if they'd like.
Une Bible des femmes, right?
There it
This
is.
is what it's called, a Bible for women, of women for women. Now, this is a classic example of what we just said with Milton. The bottom line is the Bible says what it says. We have 2,000 years of, more actually, of biblical commentary, of notation, of engagement. But what modern feminists have decided is that, our feminist values can't erase the Bible. In fact, the biggest enemy all this progressive nonsense is Judeo-Christianity. So we can't erase it. We've not been able to get people to forget about it. We have not managed to make the Bible irrelevant. So what we're going to do now is what we did to Milton. Rather than get rid of Milton in the classroom, Paradise Lost, we're going to queer Milton. What we're going to do with the Bible is feminist it. We're going to go back. We're going to project our values, our attitudes onto the book. And there's a difference between exegesis and eisegesis, right? As somebody who teaches the Bible regularly. Exegesis is when you try to explain what's actually there in the text. Let the Jews, the Hebrews, the Jews of the Old Testament, let the burgeoning new Christians of the New Testament tell you what they think. It used to be that feminists would read what the Judeo-Christian writers of the Bible said and then laugh and dismiss it. But lo and behold, they haven't been able to get rid of it. Now they've decided, instead of letting them read what the Bible says, let's project our worldview, our values, our way of seeing onto the Bible. Let's co-opt the Bible to make it sound like they're on our side. That's what kids are getting with Paradise Lost now. They're not getting Milton's poem. They're not learning what Milton has to say. They're not taking seriously those things that Milton took seriously when he wrote his epic. They're getting a long, strong, steady dose of queer theory. Same thing in the Bible now, feminist literature.
Yeah, and this is why they say if your college kid comes home, maybe over break, your college kid came home and talked about these lenses I'm using in English class, look out. But
hey, before you move on, are you still on this one?
I'm still on.
Okay, finish up.
Okay. So the authors say they consider their work to be a useful tool in this age of #MeToo. And so they gave an example of what they mean about why the women's Bible is better. So they said Mary Magdalene, okay? They said the female character who appears the most in the Gospels had been given a raw deal in many common interpretations of the text. According to Savoy, she stood by Jesus, including as he was dying on the cross when all of the male disciples were afraid. She was the first to go to his tomb and discover his resurrection. This is a fundamental character, but she is described as a prostitute and even as Jesus' lover in recent fiction.
Well, she could be both, right? A prostitute and a devotee of Christ. In fact, if you read the gospel without your stupid feminist lenses, you will find out that she was a prostitute who became a Christian. She became a supporter and a follower of Christ. Christ saved her from that life of sin. Christ reversed it for her. I love the fact that they called it these biblical scholars called Mary Magdalene a character. She's not a character, honey. She's a flesh and blood, real life woman who interacted with Christ the Savior. The fact that you called her a character tips your hand. You're not looking at the Bible as anything like a potential truth text. You are looking at the Bible as one more set of stories that has to be rewritten to conform to your feminist values.
Well, in the Parmentier, the other one, Elizabeth, she said that, we are fighting against a literal reading of the texts.
Yeah.
It's like...
We are fighting against what the text says. We are not going to let the text say what it says because it doesn't conform to our feminist attitudes.
Basically, yeah, each chapter addresses existential questions for women, questions they are still asking themselves today. While some say that you have to throw out the Bible to be a feminist, we believe the opposite.
So existential, because you couldn't find existential questions in the Bible. That's one thing. After having taught the Bible for 25 years, there are no existential questions there. Whoa. Nothing that would challenge a woman, Mary Magdalene's bloody life was an existential challenge, right? One worldview, one series of bad events in her life that trashed her life, that turned her into this sex trafficker, right? Existentially, she meets the creator of the universe and becomes his servant, not his boyfriend, not his partner in wokeness. She becomes his servant. She becomes the servant of the Most High. But those existential questions don't mean anything to the contemporary woman. To abort or not to abort? How do we turn the Gospels into a paean for Planned Parenthood? That's what we really want. And this, by the way, is nothing new. I remember 15 years ago, the Germans came out with a feminist Bible in which Jesus Christ, wait for it, was renamed Judith Christ. Because, of course, all that mattered in the sacrifice of Christ was what he had between his legs. So Jesus Christ was offensive and exclusionary, not inclusive. So they changed the name of Jesus in this German Bible to Judith Christ. And that fixed all the problems, didn't it?
It did. Absolutely. Clearly, it did. All right. So for our final story today, I just want to all the naysayers out there who still don't believe that universities will cave to every political whim. David Hogg got into Harvard University. We learned just right before Christmas via tweet that David Hogg will be attending Harvard in the fall, and he's going to plan to major in political science. And he loves everyone so much. So we put his little tweet out there for you. David Hogg, remember.
David Hogg, who could not get into second-tier schools, applied to 30, 40 schools all across the country, places like UCLA.
Okay, so it happened back. He of course took to Twitter, and he did not get into UCLA, UC Santa Barbara, UC San Diego, or UC Irvine. And then he did this whole thing in Laura Ingraham from Fox News. It was a whole spiel.
I remember.
And everyone wept for David Hogg. But our favorite no-chin, spiteful teenager is now going to Harvard, and everything seems to be okay.
Yeah, this is the problem. You couldn't get into second-tier universities with your modest, at the best, your modest academic achievements. You didn't get to go to second-rate schools. And so what have you spent your time since doing? Using fake facts, lying, and smearing people. That's pretty much what this is. There's very little academic truth in what you said. The numbers you cite, the way that you paint the NRA, you're factually inaccurate. But that mattered back when we used to care about facts. The fact that you got into Harvard on the basis of those progressive lies tells you everything that this show is trying to convey to you. That as we move forward here, whether it's teachers not being able to pass their exams, whether it's firemen having to be deconstructed by the sociological of the woman, whether it's the rewriting of the great Christian classics, the Bible and Milton, in favor of progressive values, or David Hogg getting into Harvard. Now I want to ask this question for you out there. David Hogg is the whitest of white people. He is the whitest of white men. And yet, that guy just took a position away, potentially from a qualified minority student at Harvard University, the elite university of this country. I would ask myself, if I were the Harvard faculty, how many Asian people, how many white lesbian woke people did you not take to take David Hogg simply because his radical political values, full of lies and dishonesty, by any empirical standard, David Hogg almost always gets his facts wrong. That's the qualification that made you take him to Harvard? I mean, by this standard, right, the wronger you are, even if you are a pasty white dude, the more your chances are of getting into Harvard. This is what's happening to American education. Again, it's not what you know. It's not what you can prove. It's simply about how woke you are. It doesn't matter how vapid or empty-minded. It doesn't matter how failed a student you are. The fact is if you promote the right talking points, even if you're a white man, you're getting into places like Harvard. It's a bad, after the Elizabeth Warren nastiness, where she took a position away from a Native American, she took a scholarship, a teaching scholar fellowship that was devoted to Native Americans. She took it. She launched her career on that by taking something away from a minority woman. She became filthy rich and disgustingly annoying by having taken that. Now you're going to bring David Hogg in, right? Without the academic credentials. You're bringing him in just because he has a woke profile. This is where Harvard University is in the 2019s.
All right, I hope you were all woke out there, and maybe you made it your New Year's resolution to subscribe to the Dr. Duke Show, which I hope you did. Head over to drdukeshow.com and subscribe to the podcast today.
And that does it for us this week on the Dr. Duke Show. If you like what you heard, please share the podcast with your friends. For Freedom Project, I'm Dr. Duke, she's Katie, and we'll see you next time.